few weeks now. Will be with us another few weeks. He's been working here doing a little bit of everything: 3D printing, hand building, mold making. So I'm going to introduce Adams. We have his talk tonight. Adams is a really, really unique person. I met Adams in person maybe 6 years ago, and I first experienced his work 8 years ago in Kansas City, and it blew my mind. It bridges traditions with new media, ceramics with expansive ways of thinking about video art, and I think we're going to get a preview of some of those ideas this evening. Adams holds an MFA from Indiana University and a BFA from Massachusetts College of Art. Adams has been featured in work, solo shows in New York City, group shows in New York City, the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, the Kennedy Museum in Athens, Ohio, internationally in Germany at Gallery Christine Mayer, and in Korea at the Icheon World Ceramic Center. And Adams currently lives in Kansas City, so it's a real gift to have someone as kind and generous as Adams. We're doing a workshop tomorrow. I'm sure a few of you have signed up. And thank you, Adams, for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Everybody, thanks for coming. So I've been here about 2 weeks. It's been really great so far. I'm a little more than halfway through. So now that I feel like I'm familiar with kind of the flow of the studio, so I'm really excited to dig in farther and just keep working. This right here is some of the more recent work. It's from last year. For the past couple years, I moved to Kansas City in 2021, and since then I've kind of been focusing, thinking about work as an artist and the difference between kind of a work and job. And a lot of times as artists, everything kind of merges together. So kind of being able to visualize that kind of helps me think through things, and I'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end. I'm going to start with kind of what I did most recently. Collaboration is kind of a big aspect, off and on again, aspect of my work. And this was a collaborative project with Noel Choi, who's also based in Kansas City. This is at a small exhibition space, Bad Sea, kind of right in downtown Kansas City, Missouri, and getting together with someone. She also is kind of, the collaboration is also kind of important to her. She comes at art as a kind of a similar approach that I feel like I do, but as a sculptor, performance artist. And I feel that I'm more of a kind of a materials-driven sculptor doing a couple other things. But anyway, we got talking, and we kind of recognized both having this kind of existential anxiety about the end of the world, end time, so much bad news happening that we all hear about, sort of builds in the system. So exploring that kind of basis idea, I started to visualize this information by putting together these kind of info maps. And the kind of anchor point is categorizing each general way that the world may end, and then a couple kind of sub-levels, but then using sci-fi or post-apocalyptic movies, films that I've seen as ways to kind of suss them out a little bit and explore them. And the thing that kind of brought us together too was we share a kind of similar approach, but also the same kind of viewpoint. We both like to incorporate humor in our work, both like to work with people, whether it's really directly or indirectly, and both like to really experiment and explore a kind of interdisciplinary approach. So with this, we kind of set this as a satirical bunker that some doomsday prepper would have. And our control center, which was the title of the show, is that yellow paper mache piece. We had a guard dog that was kind of in the foreground of the top left-hand image. And there's audio and there's screens everywhere, and the paintings are about 5 feet each. We had a procession to mark the end, or the beginning of the exhibition opening, and brought in a bunch of people. We had a New Orleans style marching band that was also open to kind of the experimental approach we were taking. And they would do one or two traditional songs that a New Orleans style marching band would take. and then would kind of go into like this kind of droning, setting the kind of tone of the procession sort of approach and going in and out of that. And this big snake was sort of an Ouroboros that kind of pops up like the snake eating the tail that appears in several different cultures. And I was really drawn to it because it's not necessarily one thing, it's like this kind of dual nature of it. It's like the one on the left sort of visualizes, it's like both kind of aspects, both poles, like beginning and end, light, dark, confusion, harmony, etc., etc. And so this kind of like graphic design approach is sort of like what I kind of ended on and want to move forward with, but with a lot of other things that I'll kind of show you at the end. So this was really fun. Working with people can be really fun when it works really well. Even when it works like only sort of well, it still can be really fun. You can learn a lot. And working with people, you kind of can get to a place that you couldn't really get to by yourself. So I find it a really important thing that I kind of learned the most and gained the most ground in my art making. So that's the most recent thing I did. I also put it first because it doesn't really fit with anything else I said I'm going to talk about. So early influence, I grew up in Massachusetts in the 90s. It was a pretty prosperous time in the United States. There was the desert Iraq war, but it was far away. It was like pre-mainstream internet, so it was pretty removed. But I think even as a teenager, I had a sense of some looming badness happening. And so that mentality kind of still stays with me. It happened to be just cynical East Coaster kind of vibe too. But Fugazi, important band in my life, but ones that really kind of summed up punk rock, I think, the best. And it's the music you can picture, the kind of FU attitude. But Ian MacKaye, the singer of Fugazi, really kind of summed it up. For him, it was valuing friendship over money. And that has really kind of driven my life, of my choices of even what I make to art, the micro and macro. And so, huge influence right there. Second huge early influence was Devo. Probably a lot of you, I feel like almost all of you are probably familiar, at least with Whip It. I would say Whip It is one of the songs I kind of like the least of theirs. Everything before that I find totally phenomenal. But after that they went really just kind of poppy, kind of boring. I stumbled upon this video when I was in high school, The Men Who Make Music. And so I really connected with them because they went to art school in Ohio, Kent State, and so had this kind of experimental kind of approach to what they wanted to do, thought of Devo as an art project, but were also there for the Kent State shooting, which was a horrible thing, Vietnam protest, National Guard shot and killed, I think, 2 student protesters, maybe 3. But anyway, it was everyone was horrified. After a couple weeks, everyone really wanted to forget that happened, and the people in Devo were really horrified that their friends wanted to forget their friends who had died. And so Devo is able to deliver this really kind of fun, engaging kind of art form, but still have a lot of intelligence behind it. And Devo is short for de-evolution. They have this whole attitude that after that, they're we're all de-evolving and it's all downhill from here. But they're also really experimental in what they did. And so, I don't know why I chose this part. But this video is great because it's some just kind of weird films and them in costumes and them performing as their group on stage. So anyone unfamiliar, I urge you check out Early Devo. The other real important kind of early influences in my life were comics and cartoons. And I, in high school, saw Akira, the anime. It had just like been distributed, re-envisioned, whatever, digitalized when I was in high school, so I watched it like a billion times. Definitely like the blobbiness really attracted me and definitely connects to like clay, and you'll see my work later. But also this kind of, if anyone who's seen it or remembers watching it, it sort of doesn't really make complete sense what's happening in the anime. But then I found out the comic book existed before it, and the comic book's like 1 million pages. It's like so big, multiple volumes, and it's such like a huge, fully thought out like post-apocalyptic like world that's happening after like World War III in Japan with these kind of mutant that have been tested children. But the art and the story really still influence me. I still draw on like almost daily basis, and definitely not nearly as well as here. But the drawing and the sequential kind of narrative still stay with me. The other thing is the Max, that was a comic book and was a cartoon on MTV in the 90s. Superhero genre, but very self-aware, very humorous, and using the superhero genre as a kind of a front to deal with serious issues like trauma. And so it still has this lasting effect on me. So I draw a lot, I make cups. Sometimes like a lot of people who do ceramics, I got my start in pottery. It's like the first class was like pottery 1. And that was the entry point, so it still kind of stays with me to this day. I just made some more mugs, and we'll have some available by the end of my stay if anyone's interested. But this is always a part. I'm not going to be showing this anymore. And I'm wearing the same shirt as in the picture. But I used to use these as like sort of like sketches to flesh out like bigger ideas and bigger sculptures. But they're just like a side diversion now that it's fun. It's just kind of a fun thing to do. Okay, so I went to art school in Boston. And after Boston, I moved to New York to Greenwich House Pottery, which is a studio sort of similar to this in like the heart of Manhattan. I was like a studio technician kind of resident, like pretty comparable to what a lot of staff is here. We had a resident show. Drawing, very important to me. The idea that I brought up of Devo, of like delivering something really fun, but also, at least in my thinking, using intelligence and like having some kind of social commentary or criticism in there too. And so 2007 was when cell phones were just like getting everywhere. iPhones were just starting to be common. So everyone was kind of starting to be on their phones and kind of making everyone confused who weren't on their phones. And so this drawing, this column, where the people in green were like, I saw them as drowning and on fire, but just reaching for their cell phones. They're just stand-ins for kind of everyone. iPods on the bottom to date me. But still, I think the core things of like doing drawing in some way, whether it's direct or indirect, and making sort of human-size sculpture, it's still like two things that I have that thread that I follow. So after New York, I stayed there for about 3 years. I went to grad school in southern Indiana, and anyone who's been to grad school, very experimental time. You're going through a lot of different ideas, trying to figure out like where you fit into it. And I had been in New York for 3 years. I was fortunate to have a good gallery buddy that we were really obsessed with seeing openings in New York. And so seriously, for like a year and a half, 2 times a week, we would go to see like whatever the 36 shows that were opening that night. And a lot of it was like pretty bad or like not interesting, but a lot of it was like really good, and some of it was just like mind-blowing, life-changing stuff. And this would be happening like on a cycle. This would be happening kind of a lot. And so taking all that stuff to grad school in this kind of like inward looking time, I would be going through all these kind of ideas and being kind of bored almost immediately. Like the process was more interesting than the end product to me. Like the exploring was more interesting than the end product. So I tried to figure out like what I could add to this to keep it interesting and a little unexpected to me. And I stumbled upon this, which is like this dumb kind of, if you think of like modern sculpture or painting as like heroic art, it's like this dumb, unheroic material of like slime or ooze that I played with as a kid, your kids, or whatever associated might play with still now. And so it's this great, like weird polymer that's right in the middle between liquid and solid. If you can rip it as a solid, but if you hold it and just kind of keep holding it, it will slowly kind of drip down your fingers. And so being in ceramic, very invested in ceramics, I was still thinking in terms of that and thinking of like functional vessels, but really the outward bounds of what function is or what a functional vessel is. And so this was like the breakdown of like some of the ideas that I was going through. This was a sequential process about, I think, like 3.5 hours of it going from like the first frame to the bottom left right frame. And then it allowed me to kind of play with color too and think about like what kind of marks I wanted to or didn't want to make in the ceramics and how it would hold and be released. So I think of this as just like a bottle with 3 openings, basically. I would like, before I took this photo, I'd just like cork them all like I would a bottle and then release it very slowly. And so I made a bunch of work for grad school. It was using a lot of different materials, but always the kind of core element physically and mentally was this like ceramic functional container. And got out of school, went back to New York, and had this work that I thought like it took me, as it does anyone who's been in grad school, like a couple years to really kind of get back into the right groove, purge the grad school that you didn't really need and keep the grad school you really did need. And I got to this of using these like, again, like kind of, I think of them as like unheroic materials, unarchival. Like it was plaster, like the punk urgency was really purposeful. The colors are like plasticine, like oil-based clay that you just get at like a craft store. And what I think is a real success about this is that it works for me in a couple different ways. It has some resemblance to like furniture. If you look closely, there's like small figures in parts, so it's kind of like a landscape too. It's an abstract sculpture, but working with color too and squinting a lot. Like you can think of it just as like horizontally striped painting too. So all these things were, I was really purposely just like touching on and trying to like throw in to the work, but still maintaining that sort of like oozing process. And this was in Kansas City, where I think Matt said he saw this, and it's where I met Joey too, who was also in this show. And this was like the big NCCA show of Kansas City in 2016, I think. And so this would be happening, this kind of like oozing out would be happening throughout, like, I think I worked with the staff and we all kind of timed it to just, it would happen in the opening and start to kind of dry up. The really interesting thing about this material too, it kind of like does this, it changes the sculpture and adds to it, not only adding to it, but also adding to it right in front of the visitor. So it wasn't just like a static sculpture. But as the kind of oozy stuff dried out, it would also warp and bend and become like a sculptural element in itself. And so a lot of this was a reaction on just living in like the intensity of New York or just any big city. You're kind of hit with so many different things, advertisements, whatever, social media, internet stuff, or just people yelling at you, cars honking, like everything kind of coming together. And I want to kind of process that like anxiety producing but I felt like this was still like a little too subdued. Like it was doing a lot of things, but it was doing all these things kind of quietly. And so that's when I said, I was like, what's missing is like audio and video. And so went from kind of that stuff to like trying to incorporate audio and video with the next several years of work. And so this is, this is about like almost 4 feet wall hanging, like 3.5 foot tall by like 2 deep and like maybe 2.5 wide, I guess. But in the bottom center are 2 speakers. You can't really tell the depth, but the monitor is recessed in there like about 1 foot. And it's still that ceramic container that's really just like brute utility at this point, just like kind of ugly fired stoneware. And this viscous, clear kind of stuff coming out of it. The titles I'm referring to, I kind of assigned like this identity to each one. Just that it would kind of help me decision make and build like what to do. Like honestly, it wasn't really important that it was clearly communicated. It was more like kind of insularly for me. But I would try to describe this character in the titles I was doing, like you saw on like that one, and then this guy too. And so here's a little excerpt from the video. So this video is like 20 minutes in full, and it would be looping the whole time. And so in this video you're watching, looking in the sculpture, you'll be seeing this video of the sculpture that you were in front of. And it was made to be a little disorienting and confusing, but it was also trying to get at different ways to explain the process that may not be super clear that was happening. And it was in response for like me trying to tell people who hadn't seen it, or if I didn't have the video or whatever handy, explaining like what was really happening. And it was like this slow, oozy process. It was really moving, but you couldn't tell it was moving, and you wouldn't really recognize it. But it was doing a lot, and like just kind of go back and forth and getting into these weird loops. So I figured like ways to visually explain would work better for me. And so this is like, you can hopefully tell this is like pretty heavily like time lapse, that frame from like, it was like 12 hours or something. It was just like absurdly long time. And so the ooze stuff was just like almost not noticeable at all. And so I came at this from like sculpture, ceramic point of view, very materials point of view. I didn't really have any background in video, AV, anything. And so like the only way I could really figure out, and a deadline was coming up, so the only way I could really figure this out was just do screen recording and layer. As a further kind of blurry explanation, the computer voice was like an article that was sort of like summing up some of my work. After that was like 2016, and so this sculpture was positioned directly across from another sculpture that would be having like an audio loop. So it was made to produce this really cacophonous, like disorienting environment. Again, trying to get to like what I was feeling, just like living in the craziness that I was living in. And so after that, I felt like I nailed it, at least personally. But everything was really tangled up. All these different ideas that were kind of informing my work were just like really being I was really lightly touching on, and they're really just kind of messy. So after 2016, I was trying to like disentangle things and like break things down. And so this is kind of the first formal effort of that. And what's happening, the video is a little more thought out, maybe. But the big drums have a speaker up top, and so they're so big, they're kind of acting as subwoofers, creating this really booming noise in this fairly small kind of artist run space. And again, like, still didn't know really anything about video, and was getting, like, trying different things, documenting. This is like an older work that was same kind of like long duration documentation process. And the kind of ocean theme is like more to do with like the noise and what you can hear or understand, what you can't, more than like a specific thing about the ocean. Although I'm from the ocean, and that's like definitely always with me. And so the kind of like crashing surf would be really present in the room and fairly loud. Accompanying that in the same show were these two small sculptures, this and like the twin of it. It had a very small monitor inside. This I kind of call like this phase, like, and the one right before, just like my vomiting phase of just like puke up all these different ideas and like throw them together. And like the analogy that I used at the time was like Tumblr was like big when I kind of started thinking about this, but like Instagram still really works. Of like you're endlessly scrolling and all these things are on top or below each other, and they don't really relate, but because they're next to each other, they relate, and you just kind of keep comparing and contrasting over and over and over, and how they do or don't really go together. But so like that kind of overabundance and overwhelming amount of information. And so the kind of like Doom is Coming one was playing on one of them, and on the one right next to it, the really insincere Everything is Fine is playing on the other. Both with like different, kind of putting in like a background, but different kind of ways to document this like slow, very slow dripping process that was happening. All right, so speeding up a couple years, 2020, this was, I was like so thankful for this show. So 2020, start of the pandemic, I was gearing up for like a pretty big in Sika. I was in like their big show, like the Clay Conference. Big show, I curated a big show of like New York friend, cool artist sculptors. And then like this kind of local group show was just kind of like thrown at me, like with only like a couple months to really do it. So like I could reformat this work and then pack it up and then bring it to, it was in Richmond. And so I'm so grateful for the show because, as we know, pandemic happened. This show opened, and 2 weeks after the show opened, everything shut down. And so after that, I wouldn't have really like gotten to see this work. I would have probably moved on to something else. And so like punk urgency is still there, and I started, and the humor is still there, I think. And the idea was, this was like during the time when I think like Facebook was just getting really annoying, and that people were really ranting, complaining, disinformation, just spilling their really annoying views at you, but all at the same time too. And so the idea was people are invited to sit down in the center, and all these different things were kind of basically yelling at you. Fairly important or interesting information, but it just created, again, this kind of cacophonous effect. I don't have great documentation of this, but I'll turn this up and you can see at least one of them. And so the main thing was playing like a distorted Michael Jackson's We Are the World that he got all these musicians together in the 80s, I think. But also on top of that, each of these figures were spouting something else. This one was like showing a repeated clip from like a philosophy lecture, and some were showing music, and the green one that was like kind of a diorama had like different looping sounds. At one point it was bagpipes, so it was supposed to be like really aggressive to add to the kind of really aggressive already music. And so still doing the kind of dripping things in this point, making it a little more comical. They're all kind of crying toward the end, but it was still really slow and really, it got to, because there were faces, recognized faces, it got kind of performative in the opening. They were doing some really kind of stunning, beautiful things, especially using like the difference between the translucent kind of stuff that was coming out of their eyes and the more opaque or pastel. And so you can see the image top left and bottom left are like the before the opening, after the opening. So anyone who ever thinks of possibly passing up a show that you think it may not be meaningless, I would say just go for it. They almost have nothing to lose and maybe quite a bit to gain. And so pandemic happened. I was making pottery, doing fine, just trying to survive, like I think a lot of us were. But still kind of started brainstorming about like how to break stuff down more and more. And again, trying to like visually describe this process that I thought was like really interesting what was happening, especially because it was like changing the work and changing so often. It was never really at a fixed point unless it was like photographed like this. And I was living in Massachusetts, decided I didn't really need to live there after the pandemic, and so applied and was awarded a residency in Kansas City at Belger Arts, which is another ceramic studio like this one, not so unlike this one. And it was a really great time to be there because they just opened up a glass studio, and as a resident, they invited like us as a one-time thing to get work fabricated as a way to kind of jumpstart their glass studio. And so I was thinking, I've never really had this vessel that would contain and release as like a glass, so it never was translucent, it was always ceramic. And so having that, and like, it was pretty good, like what I got out of it. It was like get what you pay for kind of situation of like, it wasn't quite right, but it was good enough. And I had like a glass friend I went to school with that was visiting, and I was kind of telling her, I wasn't really telling her in a disappointed way, but just kind of telling her this is like what I'm kind of thinking about. And she just like out of nowhere was like, she was kind of big time. She worked for Chihuly for like 10 years, like the top of the glass world. And she just won the Blown Away reality show, this recent one. This was like after, or this was before. And she just offered to. She was like, I have all these resources. I'm more of a fabricator right now. I'm happy to do it. Like, things are good right now. Spread the wealth kind of thing. And so she made this like really stunning curved funnel that was out of uranium glass, which is like illegal now too. So it was like even more amazing. So it glowed kind of green, and so that only emphasized my kind of yellow-green slime that was in there. And because it was such like an important, like precious object, precious craft object, I felt like I really needed to do that with like the wood frame. And so the one on the left is like more of like a prototype kind of situation, just to get it off the ground, kind of see what it could do, what it was doing. And then the one on the right is out of mahogany, and just like I felt like I interned when I was in college for this artist who referred to his woodworking as hack carpentry, like a hack. And that's kind of how I see it. Like, I can do some things, I'm definitely not like anything close to even a woodworker, but I felt like this is pretty good for what I can get. It's like still a pretty precious, pretty looking frame that brings up this really precious object. And so again, that was an effort to like break down and kind of direct the attention to like the one thing that I felt, at least for this, that was the most important. During this time, so getting back into ceramics, is I was working functional vessels. Cups have always been really interesting. I was working with working alongside another resident who was working with just lamps, sculptural lamps. And I never really thought of like functional ceramics in terms of like holding, containing, releasing light. And so I kind of jumped on that for like a year and like got really excited, and it was like I was in a new, really inspiring place, Kansas City, great art community. And so like I brought in like all my new friends to be like, let's put a show together and like all have a crazy lamp show. And we did, and it was great. And I think wanted to, but forgot to put a picture of it. But it was like 40 artists all made like lamps, some like ceramic people, some not ceramic people, all that had to be ceramic in some way. It was really great, just a lamp show. But from that, I kind of developed this idea of dream machines. Dream machines borrowed from an artist from the 50s, 60s, Brian Geisen, who was like friends with Burroughs. He was like kind of a beat era guy. Like Fringy wasn't really like a beat, but they were close friends for a while. And he developed this thing that was flickering, basically a rotating thing, flickered the light, and according to him, produced these alpha waves that are what your brain does when you're dreaming. So it kind of like fooled your brain into thinking you're dreaming. So according to him, you would like have this personal kind of hallucinatory experience while you were looking at his dream machines. So I thought of like bringing these kind of up to date, of getting these really aggressive and cheap, like Chinese-made lighting devices, and making again, more or less human-sized sculptures that had some of this kind of inward-facing archetypal imagery on it, to have his own kind of experience like that. And so I made several, like 8 or 10 that I made, and like 4 or 5 that I really like. And that led to physically just making bigger and bigger work from what I can make. Anyone who's kind of interested in like the tech process of this, I was had access at Belger to kilns. They're pretty similar size to the Blau kiln. Like it's like interior is like 60 inches, which is like here-ish, I think. So I made each of these in 2 pieces. Just put some like shelves inwardly and fired them together. When they're all firing blaze, place them on top of each other, and if my connections are right, it held up the top part. So you can see kind of where like they connect. There's a little bit of a transition point. But these, I figure like these are kind of monuments to working. I was really thinking, again, what I kind of brought up earlier, of like as an artist, the space between work and job and play, what you do for fun, what you do for money, is really mixed together a lot of times. So this, like, making this work and the work I'm about to show you really helped me kind of think through like how I kind of understand that for my own life. Within that, using the hand as a symbol for work, especially clay people, pinch, pinch, pinch. I kind of look to like the old kind of historic artwork that you'd see in these older museums, specifically for this kind of series, like the reliquaries of the saints. They would have these precious little bones of some saint in this really ornate hand. And so I made a whole series of like these hands as argyle, and that kind of, it's like my hand. The argyle is like a shirt I wore until it was like in pieces when I was younger. And it would all have these precious objects in there. Over time, you know, expanded from that, but I would make these like kind of formal small sculptures that had this black base and something on top. And it allowed me to kind of like be a transition from sketchbook to like bigger sculpture a lot of times, but also function on their own. And I have like so many of these now, and I'm still kind of on that route of wanting to explore that, being able to quickly explore that, being able to like figure out some of the tech, ceramic stuff like glazes, experimenting or drawing more and more. And oh yeah, and so I was doing that like last 2 years, and about late last year I was like kind of felt like I was just regurgitating the same kind of stuff. So like earlier this year, I took like a step back and just really focused on drawing, installation kind of drawing. And so thinking of these like small sculptures and really kind of thinking whatever thoughts that kind of came to me, whether stuff on the news or stuff that would be inspiring from like museums or art, just like whatever is around, would come, and I would just like sketch it out, little sketchbook, had my own like sketchbook for these drawings, filled up like hundreds of pages, and then do really bigger ones, and eventually got to like, this is just a little corner on the right, but like a 7 foot by like 14 foot, 7 foot, and the other one 14 foot wall, about like 7.5 feet tall, filled with just dozens and dozens and dozens of these drawings. And so now that I've kind of gotten into the flow of the studio, knowing where everything is now, what kind of firings to do, all this stuff, I'm kind of more going to focus the next 2 weeks on like this stuff a little bit more, and kind of bring in some more content into what has the last 2 weeks have just been kind of formal exercises and kind of getting my feet wet. And on the right, the kind of like podium level sculpture, I'm going to make a couple more of those. I have a show in this great gallery over here in March, so it's a great kind of solid, clear deadline to like make a bunch of stuff with like a basic idea and go with that. The other thing I'm really excited to be doing here is be working with the machinery you have here, specifically the laser etcher, but also the decal printer. And this is just a loose slab of clay with a commercial glaze. It's Amoco's palladium glaze. It's like a nice kind of silver, food safe apparently. But with the laser etcher, just etch away the very top surface, not even really digging in. It's all just black underneath, so it's able to get really crisp and really minutely detailed imagery out of it. And so content right now I'm still kind of exploring, but I think like the approach I'm pretty much running with here. And that's it.
A couple of hands had 6 digits. What was that about?
I think it was kind of like a joke.
But some people actually have that many. It's a
that wasn't
free
the
thing.
joke, but the fireworks, the firecrackers underneath were kind of the joke. But also I wanted to put destroy on them, and I couldn't fit destroy with just 4. So not to be taken seriously, and hopefully not making anyone upset. Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment on just like your idea of using here. It seemed to me that was like a big idea of a certain kind of punk aesthetic, where it wasn't like too elegant, too virtuosic, too refined, too much about form, but more about presenting content in a raw state.
Yeah.
That's one just sort of the idea of using.
And definitely, like, I think like the word I keep coming back to is urgency. And like a lot of the punk bands, they just want to like get their like fuck you out there to like whoever they're saying that to, and they had to do it like musically as fast as possible, but like as like roughly was fine too. But I think like if my later like more current work is kind of cutting away a lot of like the fat and like getting down to the essence, I think punk was really good at doing that. And then like the essence, I think that's where like the beauty is really, and it may not be like refined like a flower beauty, but there's something really like truthful in it.
Are all your works Cone 5?
Yeah. So I've been firing like these and these, like Cone 6-ish. Yeah, Cone 5, 6. Definitely. I'm really excited to use these Cone 10 kilns, because since my early days of doing that big like cell phone drawing sculpture have I like really been around a reduction kiln. So I'm excited to get back to like the earthiness stuff. So yeah, Cone 5, short answer. All right, let's snack.
Thank you.